We are currently broadcasting now, and I'm going to be starting the stream on Facebook in just a moment. Okay, we are live right now. The program will be starting shortly. And we're at 7 o'clock. Program will be starting in just a moment.
Welcome everyone to Lost and Found in the Field, Plein Air Poetry as Public Art. First things first, thank you for being here. And I'd like to also read a land acknowledgement. Michigan Technological University, which is where we're broadcasting from, is located within Ojibwa Chippewa homelands and ceded territory established by the Treaty of 1842, the territory of Native American nations in, and I'll read these nations in English and with my best French accent, Kiwana Bay, Lac Vieux Desert, Bad River, Lac Court Oreille, Lac du Flambeau, Red Cliff, St. Croix, and Mole Lake. So thank you for being here. Let's take just 60 seconds to settle into our seats and notice how it feels to allow ourselves just to drop into the space, to sense what it feels like to be supported by the earth. You might want to close your eyes for just a few seconds or soften your gaze and just notice for 30 seconds or so what's going on with you in this moment, as we settle in for just one precious hour of poetry and conversation about creative processes and the universe. Okay. And when you're ready, refocusing and tuning back in. My job at the moment, I'll wear a few hats this evening, but my job at the moment is to welcome you and thank you for being here, and to thank the many organizations that have made this possible, including teams from Michigan Technological University's Department of Visual and Performing Arts, the Humanities Department, the Rosé Center, the City of Shoreline's Department of Recreation, Culture, and Community, as well as the Washington State's Art Commission and the National Endowment for the Arts, and of course the panelists who will each introduce themselves throughout the evening. One note, you are welcome to throw questions our way at any time during the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom or at the top, wherever it might be located in your screen. And then we will use those as fodder for a conversation toward the end of the program and throughout. By way of introduction, my name is Beffell. I'm the director of Studio Here Now, which is co-hosting this event. It's a public art design and build firm located in Wadsworth Hall here at Michigan Technological University. And also for my students, I will serve as your professor still, students in art and nature, and finally as a contributing poet. So I'd just like to close these brief introductory remarks with a short paragraph that really served as a touchstone as we worked and pondered how we could share the voices in the Forest Project beyond its physical location in Shoreline, Washington. And also it served as a touchstone, I think, for the students in my art and nature courses. Each of us walks differently in the landscape with a different history and subject position. And so our senses will call to the forefront different elements than any other person who travels the same path. You can create images that no one else in the world can make. And that's from a podcast I developed for my students in art and nature this semester. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to David Francis, who will provide us with the core of understanding, since he is the one that conceived of and created the voices in the Forest Project. So, Dave.
Thank you, Anne. My name is David Francis. I'm the public art coordinator for the city of Shoreline, in small city north of Seattle in Washington. The Voices in the Forest Project is inspired by a sense of Chinese poetry that over several thousand years has seen poems about the same place written by poets hundreds of years separated in time, as well as working with Professor Beffell on a preceding project called Meditation Circuit, where we created a pathway in the forest and sourced poems that from poets that she had known. And I have for a long time been interested in creating public art projects that are associated with less of an object-based approach and more of a walking experience inspired by Richard Long, inspired by my work as a curator at Center on Contemporary Art, also in Seattle, where for 10 years in Carkeek Park behind me, we did a series of environmental and eco-art experiments that were on view for 2 to 3 months every year from 2009 to 2018. And I'd like to post that archive a little bit later this evening. But I'm interested in public art, especially as it concerns poetry, walking, and contemplative practice in a forested setting like we have in Shoreline, or in a desert setting, and in other landscapes. Again, with these inspirational touchstones that I've mentioned. So for this project, we created a call. We were looking for 12 specific locations in shoreline parks that were characterized by features in the landscape, such as glacial erratics that you also have in Michigan, certain trees, And we created an online archive with the idea in mind that poets who were not in the area could also participate if they wanted through video clips or photographic stills. They could examine these images and then create poetic responses based on the visual images. The other sort of homework requirements were the poems had to be short, and they had to sort of refer to specific details in the landscape. Sometimes poets were able to visit, sometimes they weren't, and we're going to hear the different creative processes that different poets adopted when they responded to the call for art. So we'll hear these different details and requirements. To narrow the Voices project down even further, we, at Anne's suggestion, focused on a single willow tree that a storm had pushed over with after it had become heavily laden with snow in, I think, the winter of 2017, and had fallen over. And willows are quick to regenerate. So we all three poets tonight, and that is they'll be introducing themselves shortly. All three poets tonight selected that particular location among all the 12 other locations. And tonight we'll hear their responses. Another request was that we concentrate not just on English, but that we ideally have poems in multiple languages translated ideally by the poets themselves, and sometimes through the cities of Shoreline's translation service, Language Link. And we were lucky enough to have some of the poets who write only in English to have their poems translated into languages like Korean, Tagalog, and others. So we hope to keep the project going. I want to thank everyone, the sponsors that Anne mentioned, and the poets tonight for their interest in this project. We'd like to keep it going and see if there are others that would be interested in later iterations and exploring the concepts that we'll explore in detail tonight. So with that, I'd like to ask the poets to introduce themselves and read their poems, and then briefly mention their creative process a little bit. We'll start with Hop Nguyen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Hop. I like to make things and write things down sometimes. This poem isn't titled, but it's in honor of the willow tree, as David had mentioned. I'm going to begin with the English version of it. What song does this remind you of? Is it the way the willows and skeletons in their outdoor closet unfurl their muletas, fingers, and mother tongues to beckon you this close? To what? Do you ever wonder what you are like to know? Perhaps it's the animals that acknowledge you as a visitor and who know without fail when the seasons change, that their understanding of home must follow suit. Is it ever possible to say bye too soon? If it is followed by a housewarming party, is being struck by lightning the same being struck by wonder? Can you hear yourself breathing this song from scratch? How do you blend in with the grass? And this is in Vietnamese. It feels silly, that's why. Bài hát nào bạn được gợi nhớ qua cách cây liễu và những bộ xương trong cái tủ ngoài trời, vứt ra những miếng vải, đấu bò, những ngón tay và tiếng mẹ đẻ. Như mọi người bạn, như mời gọi bạn lại gần. Đến cái gì? Bạn đã từng hỏi và biết bạn như thế nào? Có lẽ những con thú đã nhận bạn như một người đến thăm và Chúng chắc chắn khi bốn mùa thay đổi thì sự hiểu biết về nơi ở phải tuân theo quy luật vô thường đó. Có bao giờ nói lời chia tay quá sớm? Nếu sau đó là một bữa tiệc tân gia, phải bị sét đánh giống như cái thú vị của ngạc nhiên. Bạn có nghe được hơi thở của mình trong bài hát tự biên này không? Làm thế nào bạn len vào với cỏ? So yeah, that's how they sound differently. I did not have the pleasure of visiting this park in person, unlike the other two poets. And so thankfully David offered videos and photographs for me to experience being in the presence of the willow tree and its surroundings. And so it was an interesting process to be able to first kind of experience nature in a mediated way, and then also still not try to let that affect like how I was experiencing it, and seeing what kind of impression was being made to me with the surroundings, and then also letting myself be revealed through experiencing the landscape in that way. And yeah, that was a bit on my process. Thank you so much for listening.
Now we'll have Professor Ann Beffell read her poem about the same willow tree.
I'll go ahead and read it in English, and then we'll play the translation through the language link in Tagalog. And it was really thrilling to hear how this translated. Just the sounds and the shapes are really fascinating to me. Though I did study Latin and became conversant somewhat in French, those languages have escaped me. If you don't use them, you lose them, it's true. So, okay. Bursting. At the edge of open space, the willow tree stands. Her whips loop and fall in tangled lines, yellow, gold, gray, even more flexible than luminous. Her massive limbs, severed by 50-year snow, dig into damp earth and arc upward, framing an accidental tree fort. Her moss-sleeved branches, broken, expose her amber pith, warming as the earth. The willow tree stands, bursting at the edge of open space. And so now we can hear the Tagalog.
Sumasambulat. Sa gilid ng bukas na kapaligiran, nakatayo ang mga puno ng willow. Ang mga sanga nito'y bumabaluktot at nahuhulog sa mga linyang gusot, dilaw, ginto, abo. Umaangkop, kumikislap. Ang malalaki nitong sanga, binali ng 50 taong niebe, natabunan ng basang lupa at nakabaluktot ng pasalungat. Gumagawa ng hindi sadyang punong kuta. Ang kanyang malumot na mga tagong sanga, bali, naglalantad sa kanyang madagtang buod, nagpapainit sa lupa. Ang mga punong willow ay nakatayong sumasambulat sa gilid ng bukas na kapaligiran.
That's really beautiful to hear in a different language. So my process, I was fortunate to have a good amount of time to walk around Paramount Open Space Park. And I did a kind of walking meditation and contemplative practice, being aware of my footfall on the ground, paying attention to my breath. and came upon this willow tree and was aware there had been this devastating snowfall, one that, you know, dumped more snow than had been experienced for 50 years. And I think that is probably at the core of this poem for me. In terms of creative process specifically, I did take a lot of pictures, and I ended up writing this poem some months later. And my writing process had a lot to do with walking in the mornings here in tree-lined areas and reading into my phone, reciting in my phone, and then transferring it to text, and then reading it back into my phone and listening to it. But the rhythm of walking was incredibly important to grounding this poem. And I think that contact with the earth is something that was inspired very much by the willow tree in and of itself and its deep roots. Well, they don't have necessarily particularly deep roots, but its rootedness in the ground and its return to the ground. So that's a bit about my creative process.
Thank you, Anne. Raul?
Hello there, I'm Raul Sanchez. I'm in Seattle, Washington. And first of all, thank you, David, for inviting me to participate in the original project. Now here we are trying to make the trees grow and at the same time to nourish and respect the earth for what it is. This poem is titled Greensward, and it begins with an epigraph. It's a Kenyan proverb. Quote, treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It is loaned to you by your children, end quote. And I will start with the English because that's how it came to me. And this is a question people always ask me. So do you write in English or Spanish first? So well, it depends on what it is, on the mood. So it was in English and then the Spanish came later. Where the pavement meets the gravel road, leaves of grass and dandelion moons grow. The open meadow opens to western hemlock, Pacific madrone. Black cottonwood trees release translucent fuzzies, twirling, falling down a nursing log, sustaining life. New saplings grow within the wounded tree, trunk leaning toward the sound of the shallow stream where blackberry bushes, ivy, tall grass live. Up above the canopy, spotted towhee sings while crows and swallows fly from branch to branch, a symphony gleaming, lulled by the breeze weaving, soft emotion, warmth of the early spring. And the birds sing, melodious noise along the luminous path across the open meadow. Slow walk around the edge, step by step, meditating on the tinkling dewy grass, the glowing verdant leaves, a green oasis away from the rumbling sound of city streets. In Spanish. Oh boy. I thought I had it with me in Spanish. I'm so sorry. Wow. I spaced out on that one.
We could probably, is it possible to see it on the web? Is it printed in Spanish on the Shoreline Voices in the Forest website?
I can put it in the chat as well.
Okay, yes, I'm sorry. I spaced out.
What you prefer?
Thought I had my trip together.
This way to put it on the,
You want it on the chat?
yeah.
Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry, it's in a beautiful little PDF here, and I was being a little thick at this moment. There we go. 2 panelists, attendees. I don't know why it's not copying and pasting. I'll put
Maybe while we're waiting for the translation version, Raul, could you talk about your process a little bit, or?
Yes. When you sent me the information on the different locations, I toured all of them, and I began with the to understand the place in the beginning, especially when I parked in front, and that's why I began with when the gravel meets the road, the leaves of grass. It was a transition between the city streets onto the green space where the willow tree is. And I tried to notice everything, the color, the light, the wind, and everything that I was witnessing at the moment. As I started to make notes on my notebook, just looking around slowly, noticing how the cotton wood was, fuzzies were falling down. It had a very incredible view because it almost looked like sparkles falling off the sky. And as I approached towards the area where there's a little creek, I noticed that the dandelions, they were all full, and with the sunlight behind them, to me, they looked like moons. So I wrote about that, and every piece that I saw, I took note of it. And as I have experienced on other walking meditations that I've done, I pay attention to what is around me and try to make note of it so that I can either use it later on a poem or just to think of it as an inspiration and to remind me that things change every day, but they're still the same. But only thing that changes is the light, the temperature, the color, and the seasons. Some of those things decay, and like this tree had an unfortunate situation, but it's still there and it's still green on the bottom, even though some areas are hollowed and dried and rotten. Still,
in fact, it's regrowing, and I think we have the in the chat. If you click the link in the chat, the poem will come up.
Okay. Let's see.
We come up right as the PDF.
Okay, see the link. Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm going to read it. Césped. The epigraph. Trata bien la tierra. Tus padres no te la dieron. Tus hijos te la prestaron. Es un proverbio de Kenia. Donde el pavimento se encuentra con la grava, el césped y las lunas de diente de león crecen. El prado abierto le da paso a cicuta occidental y también al árbol madrón del Pacífico. Los árboles de algodón negro liberan su pelusa translúcida, girando, cayendo sobre el tronco decadente que mantiene la vida. Nuevos árboles crecen dentro del árbol herido, tronco inclinado en dirección hacia el murmullo del riachuelo donde los arbustos de moras, hiedra y hierbas altas crecen. Por encima del dosel, el tauji manchado canta, mientras que los cuervos y las golondrinas vuelan de rama en rama. Una brillante sinfonía, adormecida por la brisa, tejiendo tiernamente la emoción de la temprana primavera. Y los pájaros cantan, ruido melodioso a lo largo del camino luminoso que atraviesa el campo verde. Caminando lentamente a lo largo del borde, paso a paso, meditando en el rocío de la hierba tintineante, las brillantes hojas verdes semejan un oasis verdoso, lejos del ruido estruendoso de las calles de la ciudad. Okay.
Yep, great, wonderful. So we've heard the languages and the poets, and we'd like to now open this up for discussion, and Dr. Carlos Amador will lead us off here, I think. And I will close my chat down here, and I'm ready when you are, Dr. Amador.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Carlos Amador. I am a professor, associate professor of Spanish and Culture Studies here at Michigan Tech, here on Indigenous land. I'd like to thank my colleague and friend, and Beffell and Dave Francis and everybody for the opportunity to participate with you all. I think this has been a really brilliant time with wonderful poem. There was a question in the chat if there were any pictures of the willow tree. And I'd like to just get to my notes and maybe talk about, it's really fascinating to talk about process. I'm a professor of culture studies, so I work on poetry. There we go. If you guys want to see, if you don't want to see the thing, like it's the tree, there you go. And I'm sure I can. All right. And it's not often, believe it or not, that professors of literature, the visual arts, film actually talk about process other than in a kind of commercial or economic way. And I confess that that's one of my interests, but I think that one of the things that I'd really like to start the conversation with the poets in, and I had a few questions, I still have them. And please, if you're in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask a question. You don't have to be called out by name. Okay, here's one. But something that inspired me, so I'm going to deviate off the script just a little. And anybody can start in this. A question that I really wanted to talk about process is, everyone was talking about the effect of the tree, or not being able to see the tree or participate in the land. And there was an active reflection about the creative process. And I wanted to see, just to thought, what do you think is left out of the reflection, not in the sense of forgetting or absence, but rather unperceived? There's been so much active talk about how the creative process happened. I thought we could talk about some things that have emerged that maybe aren't ready to hand, how we could pull something from the experience now that we've read the poems and had that conversation, and then we can go on to some other questions. So what are some things that have been maybe absent in the back of the head, meditative, percolating there around the process of writing and engaging with this tree, this life form, and the space?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how the landscape looks on the first snow or on the first freeze, because that'll give a different tone to what I saw in the early spring. Because some birds will be absent and the landscape will be different, taller grass perhaps. The ground will be muddier and will be a little more treacherous to walk through it, especially along the line where the ravine, where the blackberry trees are, the raspberries. And it'll be a completely different thing. So it'll be like the same person, but dressed in a different way. So one thing that we'll be missing would be the seasonal changes in temperature and color and light.
I like your question a lot, Carlos. And as I sit here and reflect, I realize that yesterday, that this poem is probably rooted very much in an event 102 years ago. It was the anniversary, or actually that's a secondary event. The actual, which was the 1918 flu and the death of my great-grandmother. Not too long before that, though, she survived a horrific industrial accident, industry created accident. It's kind of the first human created environmental catastrophe that led to legislation to protect people and the land from corporate interests in the United States. And that is the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania, where close to 3,000 people were killed. And my great-grandmother, who was an immigrant from Wales, clung to the rooftop of one of the remaining buildings and survived that flood. It was a 70-foot wall of water and debris and animals, livestock, trees, barbed wire from a fence, from a factory, etc. And it's your question that makes me realize that much of the way that I relate to the land, and probably related to this tree, when you think about my sense of it being pulled down by this snow, which I'm associating with global warming, And yet that I noticed that it was creating this accidental tree fort, this home, this shelter for children to run around under at the same time. That's a great question. I hadn't made those connections until now. I think that's one of the wonderful things about art. We reach very deeply and we don't understand it for years, maybe not fully ever.
And it's fascinating to hear your memory, personal memory. None of the poems use the first person. We don't hear I. The poems don't really bring in a direct sense of personal memory. They are very much sort of in the present moment, a lyric poetry moment on the site, and they don't bring in other places and times really. And maybe that's the conditions that were dictated by the quote unquote the commission or the assignment. But again, something that all the poems here today had in common is this phenomenon that memory was not so much personal, but it was more dispersed or diffuse. Not saying it's absent, but it was there. And as we just heard Anne say, but not in a sort of I wouldn't have read that poem and thought obviously about the flood or the inspiration behind it, but yet this is the process that Carlos, your question is sort of getting at, I think.
The host would like me to unmute. That is a Zoom first for me. I made it almost all the way through COVID without that happening, and I failed today. So you guys, you are all witnesses to that. Yeah, I'd like to see if Hop wants to contribute to the question. I guess the question is what's going unperceived? What are some left out? And I think about it too in terms of what we can't conclude or contain within the poem. So if not, we can move on to the next question. There's one on the Q&A. All right. Sharon Elliott has a question. If you don't mind, I'll go to that one. It says, can you talk about how your culture manifests in your writing process and poetry? For instance, they understood Raul's poem better from the perspective of what's beyond language, but included in it. I see what they're getting at, right? Something that can't be confined in translation, but can be contained in a kind of idea and a sort of provisional encounter with language, if I think I'm interpreting it correctly. So I was wondering if we could talk about that. How does the culture, however it's defined by each of the writers, manifest in this process?
Well, I can say that not only because we might look different on the outside, but perhaps our perception about the outer world is the same. But at the same time, the cultural aspect defines us how we see things. And I think that's what you were getting at, Carlos, because an individual who might not be appreciative of nature, regardless their ethnic background, might not even be concerned about the shape of the tree or how certain weeds are growing and why, and take the time to actually look at the little dew on the leaves and just keep walking. Like, oh yeah, it's just a park. So the idea of going slowly and taking a rotation on a 360 type of view of the landscape, I would interpret that, as I said, in English in a different way. But when I translated it, I got a different sensation because of the words change, and and certain words as they change when they're used, which are not everyday language that we use with other people. It creates that reminder that that other language is also very valuable, and it's full of beautiful words that nobody uses all the time. And that is one of the aspects of poetry that I really, really like, because we can describe things that we see to others. They go like, what are you talking about? Well, it's like this. Oh, I see. So then perhaps that awakens an interest in them to go out and see what this guy saw that he's so still raving about it. So I guess the shorter answer of that would be there is from one language to the other, it creates that cultural connection between the two languages and more, so people can be more appreciative, not only of the nature that we're looking at, but their own language and how to use it to describe these beautiful things.
I really appreciate how you like tied your experience of how like different languages lend to like your understanding and appreciation of the world and just of like shared connectivity. I think one thing that really struck me was that, for example, when I translated this poem into Vietnamese, I definitely could see like the different cultural functions behind language, and the ways in which the different cultures that I've been able to experience, predominantly Vietnamese and English, how they choose to commune and why. That's why some of the ways that I was pondering or dreaming in English to me felt silly when I translated into Vietnamese. Even though Vietnamese itself is very naturally very poetic and very like what Raul was saying, and what I appreciate about different languages is sometimes like single words can be stories in and of themselves. For example, in Vietnamese, like the word pity translates directly to harmful love, or the word lemongrass translates to specifically to release. So it's very like the function, there's like a functionality and almost like small lessons inside words, Vietnamese words. So it's just interesting to be able to experience like how languages are rooted. English is what many can consider a bastard language. It has like many different kind of influences that don't really, to me, at least from my understanding of it, I do not have a professional kind of historical understanding of many languages, but I find that a lot of indigenous languages are shaped by like the landscapes that they come from, and the ways in which they make sense of their duty to the land, and how like the waterways and trees speak to them. And so it's interesting to see how much I can learn from Vietnamese and from the way people like live their lives just by speaking the language and understanding the functionality and also the deeply spiritual aspect that they incorporate through language. Yes.
Wow, this is great. There's another anonymous question here about from an ecologist who wants to know if and how the artists and poets are influenced specifically by the ecological sciences, and how ecology should be influenced through the art. I mean, there's a normative question there, but thought it was interesting when Anne talked about snow and global warming. This question popped up, right? Because it's, in fact, that's the seemingly counterintuitive thought, but in reality, it's a deeply, deeply scientific and well-grounded thought. So that's one question, and then we can continue on some of the others and ask that. Okay, so how is science, the ecological sciences, and should be influencing your art, and how is it doing so?
Maybe I can jump in. You know, I see in Raul's poem the impulse to naming the species, the birds, the sort of web of life that are all interconnected is strongly conveyed through his poem, quite differently than the way that Anne and Hop create the poem, more from a sort of a lyricism that gets almost into a transcendental or spiritual connection to nature that is also probably part of ecology, although it might be sort of a more psychological branch of ecology. With Hop's line about, and it's a paraphrase, but do you ever wonder what you are like to others, and the perspective of a self as an other. And then Anne's poem about bursting, also sort of outside of a self and into a greater unity, which is really sort of also part of the Raul poem about naming species and the interconnectedness of nature as one steps away from the city street into the césped, the meadow, the clearing.
You know, I think for me, the influence of the ecological sciences is coming from a couple of different directions. One is writing by authors like Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I'm gonna now blank on people's names. I have a stack of books of nature writers who make observations of nature and actually speak of the ecosystems that intertwine. And so Dave, I think you're right on target there with this sense of interconnection. And that's sort of one door that enters into a space that another door enters into as well. And that is, particularly having had time last summer to read, as opposed to travel and install public art projects, I started to read the recent research on ecopsychology and how there are a lot of scientists who are interested in the intersection of nature spaces, especially those which are diverse, and the well-being of human beings and how those support one another. Certainly that's been my experience as an individual, but I'm very, very excited to see sciences moving in that direction. And am in fact collaborating with a colleague here at Tech, Dr. Samantha Smith, to look at if those effects can be measured and understood more fully using scientific tools, so that we can better shape curricula and experiences for people, whether it's in art or in the college classroom or the field. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I see them as very much intertwined. And I think it is a discussion that goes back and forth as well.
Okay, there's a question on the Q&A. I'm gonna interject because I think it can really come together with, so I'm gonna ask a question that I have, and then a very big question, and then tie it to Melinda's question, which is this, oh, I think we lost Raul. Yeah, hopefully we didn't lose him permanently. Okay, so one of the questions is, one of the big ones, does poetry help you make sense of the world? And if so, how? And then Melinda's question is to Hop's description of larger imagery in English and Vietnamese. She asks, sorry, I don't know your pronoun, I apologize. They ask, is there no dynamic equivalence in translation? And if dynamic equivalence is sort of this idea that a concept or a word can be translated into another language, retaining effectively the same conceptual and imagistic meaning, I'm thinking of the word effect, that it had in its originary language, right? Formal equivalence would be a concept like bachelor, unmarried, male, pardon the concept, but dynamic equivalence is affective and meaning derived. So does poetry help you make sense of the world? And if so, how do these losses and these strangenesses between translation and imagery work out in that making sense of the world? And maybe, yeah, there we go.
Yes, of course it adds. I think poetry helps to cultivate or see like a silver lining or like a connecting thread, and also see what part of you and also part of your surroundings is simultaneously continuous and also ever changing. And so there's a lot of peace and like also discovery. I feel like, at least in the way that I experience making poetry, yeah, I find that I need to reread that person's particular question.
Sure. I'll put it right up there, unanswered. You can just go to where it says Q&A, answered, and it'll come right up. And Raul's back.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Bienvenido.
Raul. Your Vietnamese description of the larger imagery. There is a level of equivalence, but I'm also actually more intrigued by how certain things cannot be easily translated, or and also I find that when I experience languages or works of art that are translated in different languages, I find that each language also adds a depth of meaning that couldn't be touched upon by like another perspective or structure of making sense of the world. And so I think, as also Raul has already pointed out, that it's really this coming together, and it's in of itself is like a reconciliation, but like definitely a celebration of all of the cosmologies that different languages have come from, because I think the making of a language is a way of survival, especially when a lot of languages have been a means to, depending on a means to either, I can say for Vietnamese, like part assimilation and then also part preservation. So yeah, language is very loaded, but it's in and of itself a sign of survival. So yeah, thank you for your question.
May I add a little something? Sorry about it. I apologize. The battery died, but I just want to say that speaking of languages, I for a long time I like to use Nahuatl mixed with English and Spanish at the same time, because I see that despite the fact that there are borders, etc., languages carry. And even though the Spanish tried to destroy our culture, we're still speaking Nahuatl in Mexico. So I like to incorporate that, because there's some words that are so flowery and so unusual when they're pronounced, and people hear it, they go, "Oh, what language is that?" Nahuatl. Oh, from the Aztec times. Okay, so yes, to use another little thing I want to say is another local poet, Paul Nelson. For a long time, he used to hear me read poems. He says, you know, when we listen to your poetry, it's like you get us in the car and you're driving up along the road, and suddenly you make a sharp turn to the right, and then another sharp turn to the left, and then another sharp turn to the right, and then we keep going. But you never lost us, he says, meaning that when I use the word or two in Spanish in the text of the poem, immediately right after that I say the same line or an allusive to the word that I use in a different language that they didn't understand. But once I get them back on track, they didn't miss anything because it's all there.
Yeah,
so it can be intertwined.
And part of the enjoyment of the different languages in the project was part of the intention that the poems are physically displayed in the forest along signposts, and there's a QR code, and people can come up with a phone and swipe it and listen to the poet reading the poems we've heard tonight in English and in the translation language. And yet some people I know are not familiar with these languages. And when I shared it with another audience, one of the people said, but wait, it's in Korean, I can't understand Korean. And I asked them to be patient for a second and saying, just listen to the tones, listen to the voice. There is so much more information in the language beyond the specific meaning of the words. It's like a music song. So if you listen, just having a sort of rough sense in the English version for English language speakers, you may not identify individual words, but you are hearing the thoughts captured in the original language. And I think even though that the meaning is elusive, I think there's great value, and especially in this time of our culture and our political culture, of hearing different languages in a country that has been sort of misidentified as having a single language. And I mean, there is no way that this country has a single language. I mean, there are many, many, many languages. We are a country of many languages, and that's part of what the project is trying to convey. So,
and also, like Carlos was saying, perhaps the perspective of someone from a different country being in that space may be different from others. So the descriptions that they may see, they may not know what kind of tree that was. They may not know what that the raspberry bushes are thorny and they can cut you. That if you step too close into the shallowness of the little river, the stream that grows there, you might fall in and get all muddied up. And good thing there's no snakes here, like in Florida. But all those nuances are very important, especially when we go outside and write about what's around us. And that's precisely, I like to write things about the outside, the trees, the people, what I see here and there, the birds, unusual things, because to me, that's a reminder, as another part of the questions are, of resilience, like the willow tree. It's still there. The roots are still on the ground, but other new things are growing out of it. So resilience, regeneration, not necessarily recycling, but life continues. As long as they are rooted, they'll still be alive one way or another.
We're 5 minutes for 6 minutes, about 5 minutes, 6 from the end. We've had a wonderful dialogue. I just wanted to see if there are any other questions from the audience, or if there were any final remarks that Anne, Raul, David wanted to make, or I can end with my own personal question, which I don't like to take up people's space, but I have some question that I've been dying to ask. So if anybody else, please feel free. We only have a few moments, and strike while the iron is hot. Finally got that phrase right. Okay, well, I'm going to ask my last question. As somebody who writes and publishes, there's a question. The audience always comes first. That's my motto. What does the tree touch in you? I'm going to assume that T is a touch. Okay. Yeah. How is this tree an interlocutor, a speaker with you?
Well, I would say, as I was saying a little while ago, the tree it may be down, but it's not dead. And if it is, because life is still growing out of it. And that's, again, another example of things may look different. Things may look like they're decayed, but there's still some living organisms in them, cells flowing through the veins of the tree, from the roots up and down the tree. They're still breathing and using the water. So resilience and permanence.
My poem was like a lot of questions and like self-reflection also on like impermanence and what that can inspire. And so I remember someone once saying that nature is your true reflection, because that's where you'll end up. You're not going to end up in a mirror. And so how like you kind of interact with the world, how you marvel at plants, at animals, at just like Earth is kind of this a great insight into the kind of being that you are. So yeah, that's how the Willow reached me, was that, you know, how exactly do I experience time? And it's funny that poetry is a way of keeping time, but also going like beyond that, which is something I noticed that all of our works did. And so yeah, it just reminded me of like the purity of death, change, and eternity, which are constants also.
I think in me, it probably touched both a sense of deep sorrow and concern, as well as hope and resiliency. And that the actual way that it entered into my system was highly visual and tactile, you know, in terms of line and color and movement. Those are probably, you know, the texture of the moss, the color of the moss, the amazing colors of the whips on the ground. They're just so, I see half of you smiling. I mean, just like that, those golds and grays are just so fabulous, almost impossible. It's amazing that they exist right out there in the park. So those are some of the ways in which it touched me, I think.
Well, we only have about a minute left. I guess we should say our goodbyes. Or go ahead, Dave.
Carlos, we did talk about the possibility of squeezing in one more, if it's okay. We talked in the beginning.
I'm okay. I just, you know.
I would love to have a chance for you to ask your question and for us to take just a few minutes to try to answer it.
I guess, yeah, well, thank you. That's very kind of you. And Raul mentioned, and Hot mentioned something everyone talked about. My question is really about permanence and in ecological art and poetry about ecology. I think one of the things I'd like to reflect on is that poetry and ecology are actually, at least in the Latin American tradition, one of the deepest connections, and not just in terms of the words, but in the actual inscribing into the land. And I spoke earlier about one of my favorite poets, and Raul Sanchez, who has had embedded poetry into the land itself in the Atacama Desert, in this kind of permanent landscape where it's unable to erode because of its presence in the desert. And the reading is a kind of ephemeral, fleeting act, which will not be recorded by the internet. I'm wondering how can art in our temporality of impermanence, and everybody I think can answer this, how can we speak to permanence itself? And I think that I'm arguing, I hope, for a human purchase on permanence. I know it's not cool in the era of the ecological to argue for a human, but I think if we don't talk about a kind of human permanence, we may not ever understand the permanence and fluidity of nature. So how do we talk about poetry and permanence as human writers in this world?
Well, I'd like to say that right after I did that visiting at Paramount Park, another poem came out of it for a different purpose. And this ties exactly with what you're saying, Carlos. And here it goes. It's very short. There's no title. We are the human forest, where all the trees are different, yet we all share the same sun, the same air, the same rain, the same soil, where all our roots connect with each other. We are the human forest. And the thing about it is that we don't know that, because we only know from the ground above our feet. We don't know what's beneath the soil. truth is, beneath that is all those roots, just like our roots from Africa, from Asia, from other places. They're all rooted here. They just moved like the wind, like seeds blowing in different directions. And here we are, like human trees, different color, different languages, different looks, different tastes, yet we're still here, all of us. So that would be my connection to that connection, permanence that you were asking. I hope that's what.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, and Raul's comments remind me of the Asian tradition of layered sites where poems are written and often on stone and left, so that the temporality is not just a single human lifetime, but for example, at Three Travelers Cave, you can see a poem written about this cave 300 years ago, and you can respond to it and leave a poem for the next person 300 years later. So again, it sort of undermines the sense of self that is so difficult to try to comprehend as a mortal. And that is that you're going to die, but that your life is probably going to end at that point too. And you may have some spiritual beliefs that extend beyond that, but that I think, and this is where it sort of tweaks there's a discursion about what is human. And I think it pushes the boundary on what we understand in terms of ontology as human, to think of our lives as not just the self that we are now, but the DNA really in our blood is also part of who we are. Not just in our lifetime, but the DNA that we inherit, that is in us, that is someone else, but not us, but yet it is us. And we will possibly pass it along. So I don't think these are really well understood or explored, but your question makes me think about them, and it inspires me, as Raul's does. So as the poems and poetry does itself, the concept that poetry really is one of the prime art forms to unlock these kinds of ideas.
That may be a good ending place, unless Hop, did you have anything that you wanted to respond with? No? Okay. So yeah, we're at about 8:04, and as long as everybody's good, I think there are no more questions from the audience popping up. So thank you everyone for being here. Thanks everyone for their contributions, and all the organizations as well that supported us. We'll hope to do something like this again.
Stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Carlos, good to meet you. Thank you, Hop. And
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Wonderful evening. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.